issue in these cases where one person just doesn't want to be in the company anymore. They don't want to be a shareholder. They want to cash out and use the money to do the things they want to do in their life rather than watch somebody else get richer and richer and richer, running an enterprise.
Hi, guys. Been a little while since we've seen each other, which is giving me some time to read the book. There's a chapter in there that is really unlike any of the other cases we've talked about in the podcast. This is one where there's the owners of a family business. In this case, it's what's known in Minnesota very well, the Lunds and Briol grocery chains. And there's just a family member who simply wanted out. And it's funny because as you start to read it, you're like, what's the big deal? And just to set it up for people, maybe a lot of people in Minnesota know, but Kim Lund, who was the granddaughter of the founder, Russell Lund Sr. And she just didn't want to grow the company. She didn't want to sell the company. She didn't even really want to live off the profits it was producing. There really wasn't anything bad there. There's no sibling rivalry, but she wasn't even vying for any kind of a job title like we've seen in some of these other cases. She wasn't looking for decision-making power. She just wanted out, and she wanted to be essentially compensated for her shares in the business. I just keep looking at this and I go, how can this be so difficult? But it proved to be really complicated. Scott, can you take a minute just to kind of lay it out? I mean, how do we get to the point where you have one family member who just wants out of the family business and it just gets, the apple cart just completely gets turned over?
Well, even before you get to the grandchildren, the Lund story is just a fascinating story to begin with. Russell Lund Sr. Came from Wisconsin to Minnesota to go to Augsburg College and couldn't afford it. So he started working in a grocery store and grew his familiarity with the grocery business towards just working as a clerk in this grocery store on Lake Street. He later went on to form this popcorn business, went out to California, got involved in this popcorn business, made some money, came back, bought into the grocery store, took it over, grew this little enterprise into this huge operation. And, if you look for a sterling founder of a company, it'd be Russell Lund Sr. He was good to his employees. He was great to his customers. I mean, the customer service that he offered at the Lund's grocery store was amazing. He was philanthropic, created many philanthropic enterprises, including Community Emergency Services, which is still serving the families here in Minneapolis as CES. It's a huge enterprise that still operates, and so had many irons in the fire. His son, Russell Jr., wasn't interested at all in the business, and really had more of a mathematical mind, scientific mind about him. Got into an aviation business, which failed. There's a fascinating story about Russell Lund Jr., which culminates in him going through a very messy divorce. He ends up killing his wife and ends up committing suicide while either in prison, I think, or an institution. But in any case, he ends up committing suicide and passing. Russell Lund Sr. just a few months before that had passed. So the company comes down to Russell Lund Sr.'s 4 grandchildren.
So the company started by Senior is really being run by the grandchildren because the son wanted nothing to do with it, right? It was handed down.
That's right. Yeah. And Russell Lund Jr.'s oldest son, Trey, had always been interested in the business. He was Russell Lund Sr.'s little shadow, following him around, wanting to be involved in the grocery store business, really from a very young age. Now, all the Lund grandchildren were somewhat involved in working in the stores, et cetera, but it was Trey Lund, Trey coming from Russell Lund III.
Trey's a lot like his grandfather, if you think about it. He came in, watched it, and he worked his way all the way up.
That's right.
They they're seemingly in good hands.
Right. Started at the lowest level, worked his way up. His older sister, Kim, was not involved in the business. She was a teacher. Noble profession, involved in teaching fifth grade, was off doing that. And the other two grandchildren, also, though as kids they worked in the business, were not really involved in the business. So that's kind of what brings us to where we are when Kim decides she wants to get out of the business.
And just to say, in a very, very compressed period of time, Russell Lund Sr. passes away. Russell Lund Jr. kills his wife, commits suicide. So you've got trust and other things going on, but now it's the grandchildren.
Right. And you're right to point out there are trusts involved that Russell Lund Sr. set up for his grandchildren and for their children too. So those are kind of involved in the mix as well.
And we get to this point, and Kim just wants out. And Mark, the siblings, these grandchildren siblings really aren't interested in Kim wanting to get out and be divested of it. What happens there?
Well, Kim, who had her philosophy on life very similar to her grandfather's, which was to be very successful in business, but to also be philanthropic, she wanted to cash out of the company, figure out how much money her family needed to live on, and give the rest away in philanthropy. And the others didn't want that to happen. They wanted to keep the thing just running. This one is not quite as ugly as, it turns out to be ugly, but the purpose for which she wanted out of the company was very, very worthwhile.
Yeah, it was an honorable thing she wanted to do, which is interesting because when in the book you guys pointed out the dividend on an annual basis was $2.7 million. They were being paid handsomely,
right?
But she just wanted to cash out so she could have I think she really wanted a portfolio, the way I read it, to be able to do philanthropic things at a bigger level.
Exactly. And it's too bad. It highlights an issue in these cases where one person just doesn't want to be in the company anymore. They don't want to be a shareholder. They want to cash out and use the money to do the things they want to do in their life rather than watch somebody else get richer and richer and richer, running an enterprise. And I think her goals were laudable. And I think she had a right to get out. And the court ultimately determined she did have a right to get out. So then the fight was about how much and when would she get paid. And that was ultimately what happened.
And the amounts were pretty staggering. Like we said, they're getting like 2.7 on an annual basis, right, on the dividend. And then someone had to do an assessment of the value of the company. This is where it always starts to get ugly, right?
Right.
322 million is the estimate. She's one of four, so it's almost it's like $80.5 million, I guess.
That was her appraisal.
That's her. Oh, it's her appraisal.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Her Trey's appraisal was a lot lower.
I'm shocked. How'd that happen? So
that's what always happens in these cases is two people get two different experts. One comes in, we tried a case not too long ago where our expert came in at like 400 million and their expert came in at like 6 million. It just is. And then it's up to the judge, often who's not a business person and who's simply, a judge and is trying to resolve disputes, to determine all the discounting methods and what should be applied here and what should be applied there, and coming up with a number ultimately that's going to be fair. And that's ultimately what happened here.
I was just thinking about this question because in a bankruptcy proceeding, the judge is representing the company, right? They want to see what they can do to make the entity survive. What's the judge role in this one where it's two different owners who are disputing it? Is the judge just looking for a fair settlement? What is the judge's role? Is he thinking on behalf of the survival of the company or what's fair for the four?
Well, under the statute in Minnesota, what the judge should be looking at is what's the fair market value here, or the fair there's a difference between fair value and fair market value, of course. So it really depends. In Minnesota, under this, if it's purely the statute deciding it should be fair value, if the documents for the company say that shareholder who wants out gets fair market value, then it's fair market value. So it depends on somewhat on what the documents say. So in any case, when a minority shareholder proves they have a right to get out and should be able to get out, normally because they're being oppressed, and they have a right to get out because of the oppression, and there's no documents to the contrary, the judge should award them the fair value of their shares, which is what's the value of the company, what percentage do you own, that's what you get. This was a complicated case because they had some pension liabilities to employees to consider in determining what the company value was. It's a very competitive business. The competition in the Twin Cities market had substantially increased from the days, of course, when Russell Lund Sr. grew the company. But on the other hand, there had been some fairly recent valuations because, as you pointed out, Lunds bought Byerly's and became Lunds Byerly's, kind of the two upscale big chains that existed, and they had to do valuations at the time. And the combined value of the company, of course, really well exceeded what Trey Lund's appraiser thought the value was. So there were a lot of complications here in determining the value of the company.
And this was never going to be settled in a conference room. It was going to have to end up in a courtroom, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kim started trying to get out of this in the early 90s.
Right, right.
You know, now we're in the mid 2015, 2016 time period. And yeah, she had been trying to get out for a long time.
When you take a look at this case, you've got Trey, who's trying to represent and grow a company and doesn't want to incur debt. And you got the pension fund in the middle, and you got Kim that wants out. I'm just curious, when you look at what they did and how they went about it, is there something you guys would have done differently, either for Kim or for Trey, in how this played out? Because the pension fund makes it complicated.
Well, and the family used that against Kim. I mean, they actually
said they were using it against him, right?
Yeah, they dragged the pension fund in, I think, as at a time when, they wanted to make the most out of what the issues were with the company. The only thing I think that we would have done different is push it faster. Should never have taken this long. I mean, and it becomes easier. It would have been a lot easier to settle when the values of the company were much lower, instead of, getting the company up here, and all of a sudden you're taking this massive company that's doing extremely well, and someone wants to cash it out and cut into the cash flow. It just makes it more difficult. And she had wanted to do this. I think when she made her decision that she wanted to do this, she should have pulled the trigger on it then.
So Kim started out at 80 million, 80 point something million should be her cash out. It ended up at what, 45 million, a little more than half of what she thought. And it took, good Lord, how many years for this to happen? When you take a look at this, I'm just trying to figure out what's the lesson for well-run family company, people engaged, and somebody just wants to get out. I think, Mark, your point is the single biggest thing here that was the worst is the period of time it took just to get through this. What do you do when you're caught up in one of these and it's just taking too long? I mean, what do you have in your pocket that can accelerate it when you just want to get to the end?
Just litigate it. Depositions, push towards the trial date. I mean, that's what you always have to do in every single case, is you have to push towards the trial date, because nothing happens until you're actually going to trial, and that you're actually going to be in front of a jury or the judge as a fact finder of what's going on and making the determination. That's why you just have to push to get the thing to trial, and then things happen.
Do we have to read the chapter in the book to find out if Kim was happy, or are you guys going to tell us?
I think she was happy. I don't know for sure. There were a whole bunch of trust issues that were involved in this case that we talk about in the book that we haven't mentioned here. One of them being she didn't want her kids to have this source of income from the moment they hit adulthood. She really wanted her kids to have to experience what it was like to have to earn their own living until they got to 35 and then have access to their trust assets. That was also a part of this case. Interesting enough, her kids at least testified that that's what they wanted too. I'm not sure I would have that emotional maturity at that age. So
I know I would.
So I mean that was part of it, so I think she was happy, but frankly, and maybe Mark remembers if there was more of an indication of whether or not she was happy. And frankly, I think if we had been advising Trey and his other two siblings in the company, we would have said, let's try to get this done earlier too, because obviously the company grew and expanded and was worth more money when it finally got done.
Yeah, this is true. I guess my takeaway is if you're not happy with $45 million, you got bigger problems.
Yeah, but you have to remember she's paid out over 20 years at what 2.75% interest. Right now 2.75% interest is not the going rate of interest out there in the market.
Whoever gets to play the bank in that one is doing well. Yeah, this is true. Hey, Trey should have hired you guys because as we try to tell folks, if you're in one of these situations, you guys are the best at helping navigate these complex family business and shareholder challenges. And this is everything from minority shareholder rights, securities fraud, high net worth divorce, or patent litigation. You really are prepared and you're willing to answer questions, which, by the way, people can ask questions even on this podcast. They can ask it. But we really encourage anybody who's watching this, has an issue, it's something that's bothering you, go to briollaw.com. If you have questions about your family business or any other complex commercial cases, just send them to us by emailing podcast@briollaw.com. And to subscribe to the podcast, you can find us on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Hey, Mark and Scott, thanks for your time today. We'll see you on the next podcast. Between now and then, I'm going to make my list of what I'd spend $45 million on. I'll let you know.
Over 20 years.